Philip, let me start with you and just get a sense of your understanding of the state of play. You were there in Pakistan last weekend for those talks with Vice President J.D. Vance. There hasn't been an official announcement of a second round of those talks. What are you hearing from sources there on the ground of what might happen there in the coming days when it comes to negotiations over peace in the region?
Well, look, there's certainly optimism that Islamabad can be the city and indeed Pakistan, the country, as the facilitator that puts up a second round of talks between the United States and Iran. Of course, as you just mentioned, there's all sorts of confusion right now as to whether these two sides are close enough right now or can come close enough over the next few days to actually meet in person. It seemed like everything was falling into place yesterday. Essentially, the announcement of a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, and that was a holding ceasefire, and indeed largely still is. That is a key building block toward further talks between Iran and the United States. Then the announcement from the president that the Strait of Hormuz was open again. That was an announcement that was mirrored by the Iranian foreign minister. But then it was, again, entirely stopped by the Iranian leadership. It now says the Strait of Hormuz is closed. And indeed, the UK military, which is the authority on this kind of thing, says that not one but two ships, one tanker and one cargo vessel, have been attacked. One by Iranian gunships of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. That's according to the UK military. So things not exactly under control right now, I think is the fair way to put it. But that doesn't mean that the two sides cannot get together at the negotiating table. The rhetoric can be all over the place at the high level, and it might even be for domestic consumption in the United States and Iran, indeed, as well, while the two sides still are able to get together at the negotiating table and somehow not necessarily come to an overarching peace agreement, but at least get that little bit closer, at the very least in the short term, to extending a ceasefire, because the ceasefire between the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other, it is only 2 weeks long. It's only got a few days left, and that needs to be extended. That is why Pakistan hopes it can get the two sides together here in Islamabad as quickly as possible.
Michelle, I want to bring you in because you did a really great podcast talking about how Pakistan ended up where it is, with the only real country, with maybe one other exception, that could facilitate these talks. And then how well are they going to be able to execute this? Because it's a terrible position. We've been saying Iran is saying one thing is true, the President of the United States is saying the other thing isn't true. Is it clear what the Pakistanis are saying either to the US or to Iran?
Well, I think we probably all understand that what happens actually in a negotiation at the point that the parties meet, the most successful ones, there's so much that goes on behind the scenes. Right. And it's clear that in the last week since the Islamabad talks happened, Pakistan has been busy on the diplomatic front. So the army chief went to Tehran a few days ago. So there have been like face-to-face meetings as well as the working of the phones. I think they will be really hoping that the relationship that was built up with the Trump administration in the last year continues to bear fruit. And frankly, it is really the only diplomatic possibility in this very complicated world that we have. Pakistan hasn't had the easiest relationship with Iran. About 18 months ago, they were striking what they call terrorist hideouts on each other's soil. So that hasn't been without its own complexity, but they have found themselves in this pivotal position. So they're going to continue to try and use that as much as possible. But I think it's clear from the gap between what the president has said in the last 24 hours, from what we know is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, and also from what the Iranians are saying, that there is an immense task to do, that even at the point where there is some kind of agreement, how fragile it is likely to be. So we're 7 weeks into this, and if anything, while we have some moments of hope, I think it continues to be an incredibly complex and confusing international situation.
Seems like a very tall order, not a lot of time.
Jeff Mason, on the issue of complexity and what you're hearing from the White House about how they're viewing this conflict and the next steps forward, you have a president who, at least if you read these social media posts, seems very eager for this to be over, to put some real finality on all of this. We were speaking with Phil Crowther just a moment ago about the prospects of continued talks in Pakistan. Are we hearing anything from the president's aides about what those might look like, the appetite for those talks, and indeed if the vice president would be the point person for those talks if they were to happen once again?
Well, the president's aides don't want to get ahead of the president. So that's a kind of a constant challenge, I think, both for the people who work in the White House and for those of us who cover it. They take their signals from what the president is saying, and we do too. The president has said that he could potentially go to Pakistan. That seems pretty unlikely given the security situation. What I've been told by at least one aide at the White House is that it's likely to be the same trio that we saw the last time. So Vice President Vance, Jared Kushner, who's the president's son-in-law, and Steve Witkoff, who has served as an envoy for President Trump in Russia and on the Iran talks. So that's likely to be the cast of characters. But again, there's still a question mark over when this will happen. And there's also a question mark over whether or not they've actually laid out the sketches of a peace deal in the way that President Trump has said. The president, again, really helping boost sentiment about within the markets and elsewhere on Friday with his positive language about a potential deal. But Iran has not been confirming most of the elements that the president said have been agreed.
And I believe we have, I'm not sure if we have them ready, the pool is getting ready to go in. I think we have some live pictures from the White House. Yes, we do. This is the president in the Oval Office. Wait, it's on a different topic. He's speaking on psychedelics right now. So
Psychedelics.
We're going to stick with this, and we're going to wait to see what questions are asked. Phil, I want to go to you because what Jeff was just talking about, what has been done in advance of these negotiations. You know, this administration that kind of likes to muscle its way through some of these tough talks. And look, I'll be honest with you, as someone who's covered diplomacy, sometimes that's useful. Sometimes people are a little too rigid about format and working groups, and sometimes that's helpful. But I was talking with a couple of State Department sources this morning who told me, to their knowledge, no one from the State Department is scheduled to travel there. You're on the ground. Have you seen any advance work, any pre-delegates showing up from the U.S.? To Michelle's point, is there energy on the ground? Are people talking in preparations for these talks, or are they just not there yet?
Look, in terms of visitors, any diplomats or any high-ranking officials, nothing to report at this point. Essentially, both countries, both governments, Iran and the United States, anyone who would take part in these talks, they've been told to be ready to travel, essentially, at a moment's notice. Islamabad is getting ready for this, that much is for sure. Any of us who've covered big summits know that this is a city that is getting ready for further high-profile visits. It is pretty obvious with events being cancelled, with everything being prepared, roads closed. That much is pretty obvious. You have to be ready just in case. It all depends, of course, as well, what kind of security preparations you need. Depends on how high the visitors might be. Will the vice president be here again? And as Jeff just mentioned, the president himself did at least float that idea somewhat, that he would be willing to come to Islamabad if there was something to sign. We all know that he loves to sign an agreement, some kind of a peace agreement. If there is one to sign, he wants to be the one who signs it, not someone like Steve Witkoff or J.D. Vance. In that case, I think you can expect him to be traveling here despite a security situation that hasn't led to many U.S. presidents, after all, visiting Pakistan over the last few decades. But there has been speculation here for the whole week, despite the fact that the talks at the weekend ended in what first was seen as a failure because there was nothing to sign, there was no agreement, there was nothing. But still afterwards, you know, we did get the details that they did agree upon a lot more than someone like J.D. Vance was willing to admit in his short press appearance after those talks came to an end. So there is more agreement than you might be able to make out from the rhetoric, at least, when it comes to President Trump, or indeed Iran's president, its foreign minister, or indeed its parliament speaker. Some of that rhetoric, especially over the last 12 hours or so, has been particularly aggressive. That does not mean that the two sides can't come to the negotiating table, and Islamabad is certainly preparing for that eventuality.
Fair point.
Philip Crowther talking about the president's propensity for signing documents. He's in the Oval Office signing what we gather is an executive order that would accelerate access to research on psychedelic drugs. Michelle Hussein, I'll take advantage of you being here from London and ask you sort of what the mood or conversation is like among the British government, other European governments, about the Middle East. So there was an effort a couple of days ago to gather some allies of the U.S., strained as they are, to talk about sort of securing the Strait of Hormuz. What is the conversation like now, many weeks after that initial entreaty from the President of the United States, for these allies to get involved in patrolling and protecting it?
Well, I think there's clearly the willingness to be part of the solution once the solution looks like it's being agreed. And I think it's really worth remembering how what is at stake economically globally? Because I've been struck by being in the US in the last week how far away the war feels. And yet in the UK, even though it's not in the position of India and Pakistan where so much energy is coming from the Gulf, however, a country like the UK's G7 economy remains a large energy importer. And I've seen, like, within about a week of this war breaking out, people who saw their mortgage deals being pulled from the market, the UK government realizing that with what growth forecasts are now looking like, the things that it hoped to do later in the year, and it's a government that's under a lot of pressure from voters to the left and to the right, a lot of those calculations are now being completely upended. So there's immense self-interest and a prize for getting involved to try and make any solution last. But equally, countries like the UK want to keep a distance from the actual theatre of hostility. So it's a really, really difficult dilemma. Like, they want to work something out, but equally not wanting to be actually involved in this conflict.
Jeff Mason, I want to ask you, because we had some sound earlier from the president on Air Force One being asked about what we've been talking about, the different messaging from Iran and from the president himself. You know, the president saying Iran has agreed on all this, and Iranian, it's a little unclear who exactly is in charge, but different ministers, officials saying that's not the case. And the president said something that flags a little interesting to me. He basically said, well, you know, they've got their own people that they've got to, you know, deal with. I've got my people. It was almost the equivalent of all politics are local. He didn't seem that worried about this. Do you think that is because, as we've been talking about, there have been behind the scenes communications? He's confident that something will go forward, or do you think it's just the president brushing off any potential criticism?
I think it's at least in part because he's just over it and wants to be done. And so he has shifted his language to talk in a more positive way. He has said things like, I trust the Iranians. He sees a reason to trust the Iranians. That is exactly polar opposite of the language that he was using before this war began, during the war, and honestly, just the history between Iran and the United States and the international community for decades. So I don't know where that trust is coming from now, other than the fact that the president is absolutely eager for this to be over. That's not to say that they haven't agreed some things, and there are some hints as to what they have agreed. In fact, ironically, some of those things are somewhat similar to the agreement that was made under President Barack Obama's administration, which the president pulled out of during his first term. That will be a very interesting irony if any eventual agreement ends up looking similar to that. But for now, the details are sketchy. The details on whether talks are going to happen are sketchy. But what is not sketchy is that the president is pretty clearly moving in the direction of wanting to have peace, even if that doesn't mean all the details that he has laid out are fully accurate, or even if he doesn't achieve all of the goals that he and many conservative hawks around him would like to see achieved.
Jeff, we've got about 60 seconds left here. You've been listening to the president as he went to Nevada, to Arizona after that. How much is this eclipsing what he wants to be talking about, be that psychedelics today or the economy?
Him, including Susie Wiles.
Yeah, or the economy as he was scheduled to speak about in Nevada.
A lot. It's a lot. And the reason for that, of course, is that the midterm elections are getting closer and closer every day. November seems like it's far off, but polls have his popularity, and as reflected in polls, have really been hurt by the high gasoline prices. And that is at the top of their minds. And they're wanting to change the subject and change the trajectory going into that very pivotal fall.